The trap had been set, and the explosive charges set by de Villar functioned as intended, except for one, sparing Lieutenant Takiro Akida's archer. Kerensky's eyes narrowed as her heads-up display told the tale. Enemy militia tanks to their 6 on fast approach for an intercept course. In seconds, the mission had gone from a simple smash and grab to a game of cut and fucking run. And the Queen of Spades resolved from the drop that they would do more cutting than running. The initiative favored the Widows as the 2 elite commanders began setting up their various strategies. And Gomez Cristobal de Villar of the Legion's recon lance moved hastily forward, looking to survey the damage his bombs had caused himself. Caught off guard and thrown off kilter, the Widows were in complete disarray, their seemingly random movements being contrasted by the Legion as their recon lance jumped on them like the last chopper out of Nam. With the Widows so tightly concentrated at the outskirts of the city, the Legion was in a perfect position to draw a tightly controlled zone defense around the lion's share of their enemy, with the goal to corral the Widows and drive them up through the heart of the battlefield toward the skirmish line. This initial strategy seemed mostly effective, as mech warrior Simon Fraser's Stinger continued the split movement the Widows had thus far embraced, while Charles Baer took the Legion's fire lance forward in a compact spearhead maneuver to drive a wedge through the Widow forces, spreading them apart to be individually focused on more easily. By the time the Legion's command lance finally decided to make their move, Kerensky had managed to mostly pull her forces together and out of the city, flanked steadily by her second-in-command Colin McLaren inside his Marauder, which is a good mech. You know that by now. The 2 commanders were sizing each other up. At this distance, both were aware that none of the other's forces would be within weapons range. Kerensky knew Carlyle was testing her, seeing whether or not the trap combined with the incoming militia forces had exposed any weakness, or would show him an opening he could exploit, no matter how small it may seem. Armed with this knowledge, Kerensky began to issue a series of orders to bring her team closer and to create a cone of fire to drive through the heart of her enemies. As for Carlyle, he knew he need only to keep the Widow responding to the Legion's movements, making certain their focus was on his team to give the militia the best opportunity to catch them off guard and do some major damage. The Widows managed to keep their initiative momentum, but the victory seemed impossible, as they would be on the defense from both sides. As the Legion's recon lance continued their westward push, Kerensky began ordering parts of her forces to drive southward, while she herself continued to take point, content to make a target out of herself for the sake of the rest of her unit's advancement. As each side continued to maneuver themselves into firing position, Carlyle took up a command position inside a dense patch of woods. Not wanting to play into the Black Widow's hand, he needed to go where he would be free to communicate with and command the rest of his troops with tactical impunity. Joined soon by his lance-mate Delmar Clay and his Wolverine, the pair watched closely as the Widows could do nothing but try and take up the best positions against the oncoming support, with the options being run and get shot in the back, or turn to face the music and get clobbered by the devastating weapons carried by the militia tank crews. Carlyle's first order of business from his forested fortress was keeping his fire lance firmly planted on the battlefield's southeast side, knowing full well that their play was simply a waiting game, looking to engage the first viable target that entered their effective ranges. Only Charles Baer ventured forward from his position in his Crusader, another feint by the Legion to catch the Widows looking. Colin McLaren was the last widow to escape the city in his marauder, keeping close to Kerensky to cover her while she executed her plans. The widows were only now beginning to regroup, and the Legion still had the distinct tactical advantage of preparedness, continuing to stay close together and fortify their positions while the widows struggled to put together an attack approach that could only be described as taciturn at best. Eager to get someone, anyone, within range, the widows began looking in earnest for any shots that could be taken. Much to their consternation, the widows' desires were stifled by the cautious advancement of the Legion, who were in no hurry to find themselves under their guns. For a moment, it almost felt to Kerensky like Carlyle was taunting her, setting up to view the oncoming carnage as the widows were now stuck in a position of run and gun, or dig and defend. Scans came up over her HUD that pegged the Legion's battlefield support as crews commanding the dreaded Rommel, a nightmarish LRM carrier, and a Maxim hover tank. Kerensky plotted her course into the Warhammer's navicomputer. A few widows would keep an eye out as rear guard, and the others would trudge onward, despite knowing that they now walked into the lion's den with nothing but hate and discontent waiting for them. Cresting the hill to the rear, the militia tank crews crept up on the widows, deploying to spread fire and cover as much ground as possible. As if by sheer willpower alone, Kerensky and her widows managed to continue to stay in front of the initiative 90 seconds into the engagement. This was only a stopgap victory, however, as the widows needed to keep the ball in their court for as long as possible to simply catch up, and even the odds that they currently faced. Pulling back from her reconnaissance position, mech warrior Lori Kalmar joined her commander by leaping her Shadowhawk next to Delmar Clay's Wolverine so as to avoid any damage attempts from the elite and veteran mech warriors of the Widow's Fire Lance. While elements of the Widow's Recon Lance moved into cover, Carlyle's vantage point left him with the realization that the battle was now moving toward the center of the combat zone, and as such, he coolly began to order his mech warriors to begin reinforcing this area, hoping to cause the widows to walk headfirst into a slaughter. The widows, however, were beginning to get wise to the Legion's scheme, and as Kerensky watched the Legion move further and further into the gap, it was a no-brainer to order her troops into defensive positions. She knew she needed to buy time. There was no need to rush out and meet an enemy already waiting for her. And if these dogs wanted to hunt, she'd make them earn their pay. The Legion kept moving forward, taking defilade by nearby hills and trees, but Kerensky knew ordering everyone to move at full speed in their direction was folly, and would open up their rear to the militia. As a feint, Nichols bolted his Phoenix Hawk up and through the center of the battlefield, attempting to draw the Legion in and give Carlyle and the rest of his units something to shoot at, while a few widows kept cautiously back as insurance against the oncoming tanks. Miklos Delius lurched his archer forward to aid in this endeavor, while the Legion's Fire Lance was content to backpedal, fortify their positions. The Widow's Recon Lance stayed hidden, not giving the Legion the opportunity to play their strategy out. Colin McLaren and Lynn Sheridan each used their mechs to play a hunch, centering around the outskirts of the city and waiting for the enemy tank commanders to arrive. Their prediction turned out to be correct. The militia command crew blazed the Rommel right up Main Street, and this prediction had only barely allowed Sheridan to stay outside 90 meters from the Rommel's fearsome autocannon. While not at optimal range, the cannon was still within the mid-range of its effective capability, and Sheridan would have to hope that this would be enough to be able to take out that commander while avoiding any serious damage to her own equipment. Her fears were slightly allayed as she and McLaren were joined in a supporting action by cohorts John Hayes and Takiro Akita. The first shots of the day finally rang out as the thundering of the Rommel's autocannon report filled the air. Despite the cannon shells sailing wide past Sheridan's Crusader, the deafening noise jarred Lieutenant Akita and Mech Warrior Hayes. Sheridan scored the only successful shot against the incoming tank, while missile and particle cannon fire from her fellows and the Archer and Griffin harmlessly fell to his side. Working in tandem, Kerensky and McLaren laid down a blistering cover spread of PPC and autocannon fire to keep the heat off, but this action could not spare Delius's Archer from the wrath of Carlisle's Marauder. With twin PPCs firing, the Grey Death scorched armor away from the incoming threat. Delius fought the controls of the 70-ton hunk of metal, and Legionnaire Davis McCall took advantage while Delius faltered. Adding dual autocannons onto the damage already inflicted by his commander, the Archer was much worse for wear, covered in pockmarks from its brush with the duo. Fortune was with Delius, however, as his wavering caused missile fire to scream past his machine instead of connecting, and Isuru Koga smashed his fists against the command couch arms of his Archer for missing such an easy, foundering target. Warning alarms blared in Kerensky's ear as the militia's LRM carriers sent 60 armed warheads on a collision course with her Warhammer, giving her time to deftly sidestep the carrier's salvo and avoid them completely. The middle of the battlefield had become a hail of gunfire, but with the usual nerves and confusion of finally being within striking distance ruling the day, no other combatants could connect with their intended targets. For Kerensky, now was the time to get out of the kill zone. With the militia tanks trying to run her down, Kerensky and the Widows managed to stay in front of the initiative pendulum for a remarkable 2 minutes. And with things getting into the nitty-gritty, this is exactly the time that such fortitude was most valuable. The Legion's hold on the battlefield was beginning to come into question, and Colin McLaren began the march away from the tanks, knowing he and his Marauder were backed up by his lance mates. He was shortly joined by Kerensky as she continued to take point against the Legion, and it was all the Legion could do to continue their plan as the Widows approached by standing fast in their prepared defensive positions and steeling themselves for what was coming. Carlisle kept his feet firmly planted, drawing a bead on Kerensky's approaching Warhammer. Nikolai Koniev bolted his Wasp into a position where he may soon be able to escape with the cargo he carried. And it was not too long until elements of both forces had made a hard stance on either side of the northern hill, each daring each other to make the first move. Meanwhile, in the squared circle, the Legion's fire lance was slowly beginning to come down from their hilltop hideout. Miklos Delius was not eager to be under the Legion's guns a second time. Taking his Archer around the northern hill his fellows had rallied around, he hoped to add some muscle to their position, perhaps keeping Legionnaires from getting cocky and trying to descend on the lighter mechs while keeping his own nose out of trouble. Seeing the Widows make a break for the gap drove Mech Warrior Charles Bear into action. He threw down the throttle of his Crusader and made a break for Kerensky's Warhammer, hoping to position himself such that he could blindside her as she came out into the open. This opportunity at the Widow was also enticing for the Legion's Tracy Maxwell Kent, knowing she was backed up by her commander's Marauder, Davis McCall's Rifleman, and Delmar Clay's Wolverine in the woods to her rear. The northern hill, where several mech warriors took defilade, had turned into a powder keg, with over 2 full lances of mechs crowded around it. Mech warrior Lynn Sheridan made all speed to get the hell away from the Rommel, whose crew had shockingly retreated slightly as it saw nothing but Black Widow Company mechs filling up their forward viewport. McLaren and Hayes lit into the militia's LRM carrier, blowing the doors off the advancing tank and leaving it 1 LRM short. Even as the carrier itself tossed another 60 missiles into the air, the tremendous fusillade from the pair threw off the crew's aim, causing less than a third of the missiles to land on McLaren's Marauder. Nichols used his Phoenix Hawk to tear into Aaron Sharpley's Stinger unanswered, and long-range missiles from Delius's Archers streaked past him, piling onto the unfortunate Randolph Blake, leaving his own Stinger as worse for wear as Sharpley's, bringing retreat onto the table as a serious option. The panicked radio chatter from his two weakest lance mates sent Grayson Carlisle into a rage. With smoldering anger, he turned his Marauder's twin particle cannons on Kerensky and with deadly accuracy cast them both dead center on the Widowmaker's Warhammer. Combined with fire from Davis McCall's riflemen in response to Kerensky's own barrage against him, the two managed to topple the Widow. The telltale signs of critical engine and gyroscope damage blared in Kerensky's ear. As the 70-ton beast carrying one of the Inner Sphere's deadliest mech warriors crashed to the dirt, Gentleman Johnny Clavel squeezed a burst from his rifleman at McCall's, but the shots did nothing to take the rifleman off its feet, much to his great chagrin. As other, much smaller dances played out across the battlefield, a cheer went up from some legionnaire, but Carlisle was concerned that their task had seemingly been accomplished too easily. Even with their commander down, the Widows were not backing off. For the moment, it seemed the Widow had left one kill zone for another. With ice water running through her veins, Kerensky stayed down instead of attempting to stand, making a narrow target out of herself and communicating from a prone position while her Warhammer's heat sinks shunted away the excess waste heat the machine's severely cracked engine shielding had suffered. With the timing of the moment being so crucial, it was of the utmost importance to be in front of the initiative, and the Widows managed to pull it off yet again. With one of the militia tanks heavily damaged, Carlisle knew if he did not play his cards right, the Widows would slowly and surely steal away the advantages he'd so carefully stacked the deck in order to achieve. Ordering elements of his command lance to backpedal to meet the advancing Widow mechs, his fire lance advanced into the gap to hopefully cut the Widows off if Carlisle's movements could draw them in. The Widows were nobody's fool, however, and played defense in response, sending their lighter mechs up through the gap to draw fire, as well as attempt to escape with the cargo they carried. This strategy was mostly effective, as the Legion's heavy and medium mechs closed range with lighter Widow mechs, while staying off of Kerensky as Aikita, Delius, and McLaren rallied around her. The nitty-gritty was either upon them or soon to be, as mech warrior Momar Yahan leapt his Stinger out and into the heart of the action. This maneuver led to several mini-strategies playing themselves out right before Carlisle's eyes, as his viewport soon filled the fuck up with mechs from both sides, eager to capitalize on one another in the best way possible. As his heart pounded and the sweat rolled down his brow from inside the humid cockpit of his Marauder, he hoped his troops could stomp a few of the easier targets and position themselves in a prime spot to begin to work on their prey. While Nichols pushed forward in his Phoenix Hawk, Grayson Carlisle decided the best defense was a good offense, and stayed put right where he was. He would only move if the Widows forced his hand. There was now such a large concentration of writhing metal jockeying for position toward the center of the battlefield that even the most expert marksman would have trouble drawing a bead on any one mech in particular. This was no more apparent than for the Legion's de Villar, as he was so focused on the mech's soup in his viewport that combat stress momentarily shook his concentration and left him unable to fire. Legionnaire Delmar Clay lost focus drawing a bead on Koniev's Wasp, stolen away by mech warrior Charles Bear losing control of his Crusader under the combined barrage of McLaren and Hayes. The two were proving to be an effective and certainly deadly pair. Only Asuru Koga pulled his focus together long enough to make another attack run at Kerensky's down Warhammer, but was greeted by frustration yet again, as out of the 40 missiles fired, only half struck, and the Widow twisted her mech around in the soil to avoid them. A great gnashing of teeth was taking place off to Koga's 2 o'clock position where lasers, missiles, and machine gun rounds hit the sky like maybugs. as each mech warrior involved in the action hoped it would be their shot that left them the smartest man on the cinder. Aiding his fellows that were knee-deep in Legion woes, Gentleman Johnny managed to connect with Lori Kalmar's Shadowhawk after he'd steadied his rifleman for a better firing position. This caused her own shots to go wide. Despite Carlisle laying down a white-hot line of laser and autocannon fire against Simon Fraser's Stinger, Legionnaires Blake and Sharpley had no luck in the fracas to back it up. Gritting his teeth and squeezing the triggers, mech warrior Davis McCall unleashed a torrent of autocannon fire that left Fraser's head spinning as it shredded his sensor and life support equipment. Fraser's main concern now was getting out with his life. Fraser managed to summon the testicular fortitude necessary to lash out against Kent with his Stinger's foot, but up to that point, she was more worried about the slew of long-range missiles Delius had managed to land against her from his Archer, and thanked her lucky stars that Lieutenant Aikida could not duplicate this success. As other shots continued to sizzle past their intended targets, mech warrior Alex Ward threw a metal fist toward Aaron Sharpley's Stinger with his own. The fist dug into the non-existent armor of Sharpley's center torso, and Ward saw the news over his HUD that he'd been looking for. The heat spike that could only be the result of a cracked engine shielding inside his spindly foe. Carlisle was now beginning to worry that his advantages had been almost completely eaten up by the Widows, and the burden of kill zones seemed to be switching over to threaten the Legion. With almost preternatural fortitude, the Widows kept their initiative momentum going for a solid 3 minutes, and they needed all the help they could get. Mech warrior Koniev made his final break to get himself and his damaged Wasp out of harm's way, but Delmar Clay kept close in his Wolverine to avoid suffering the same issues as he had just a moment ago. Koniev just needed to make it through once more. Just fucking once. Lynn Sheridan sensed her fellow Nichols was onto something, so she charged her Crusader to the battlefield's north side as they tried to pry their way free. The Widow's strategy was paying off. Kerensky smiled a devilish side grin as she watched her heads-up display from the ground, showing mech after Legion mech pushing eastward and chasing down the lighter Widow's scouts as they made a break for freedom, knowing that each Legionnaire heading in that direction gave her troops more ability to move about the center without being caught up in a Hogan's Alley-style shootout. If she could just draw enough of them away similarly, the Widows would have a much better chance at being able to achieve a full regroup. In what would be a most fateful move, Lieutenant Takira Akita calmly strode his Archer toward the fracas, while setting his missiles up directly on Carlisle should he continue to hide himself away. While McLaren and Hayes continued to run point for Kerensky as she stayed prone and staved off massive heat from her badly damaged engine shielding, Nichols used his Phoenix Hawk to draw even more Legionnaires away, cutting the Legion's fire lance off from the action on the other side of the battlefield. Fighting the controls of the Crusader, Charles Baer managed to finally bring his machine to an upright position. Clavel rounded the hill Baer had taken cover behind, only to realize he'd first have to fend off the guns of Legionnaire Khaled's Warhammer. Fate cast its hand. Joined only by his partner Lori Kalmar, Grayson Carlisle kept his woodland retreat as predicted by Lieutenant Akita, and he punched the telemetry for his intended missile fire into his onboard computer to immediately launch 40 long-range missiles toward the Legion commander upon completion. The militia crews were starting to waver, partly because they are useless weakened warriors, and partly because their resolve had been shaken at the regrouped Black Widow Company, refusing to give up or back down after what seemed like such a devastating blow to their commander. Carlisle trained his guns on Kerensky's downed Warhammer, blasting away at the Widow to embolden the hearts of the militia crews. He slammed his fist against the side of the cockpit in frustration when 2 more direct hits didn't put the mech out of action, and with his focus so tightly fixated on it, he didn't even see Akita's missiles coming. The long-range missiles from the Archer ripped into the torso of Grayson's Marauder, the fire from the explosions leaping up in a plume over his cockpit glass, leaving him temporarily blind. Just as the flames subsided, his onboard computers were throwing fits. Warning lights blinked in his eyes and alarms pierced his ears. His machine's massive gyroscope had been damaged, and his engine shielding cracked. Instantly, and with almost no hesitation, Carlyle fought the controls of the Marauder to keep it upright, which stole away his focus for a second time. McLaren and Clavel blessed the 75-ton monster with a concentrated stream of hate while its controller was otherwise occupied. The combined barrage from the trio sent Carlyle's mech slamming face first into the dirt, and the militia was now packing up and heading for the hills. At this sight, combined with a hail of missiles crashing around his Stinger from all angles and the massive damage he'd suffered, left sharply inclined to agree with the militia that it was time for him to make a hasty exit, lest he find himself among the dispossessed. A large laser from Nichols' Phoenix Hawk sliced through the leg armor of de Villar's Griffin. Stumbling as sparks showered from the hole the laser had carved, and unable to control his shot, de Villar's particle cannon blast went wild and sent a cloud of gravel flying into the air as it struck the hillside his intended target, Alex Ward, had hidden behind. The billowing black smoke from the gouge in the Griffin's legs sent Blake's nerves over the edge, and he soon found himself looking to follow Sharpley's timely exit. Suppressing fear, Lori Kalmar stepped her Shadowhawk up in defense of her partner and triggered her mech's autocannon and LR impact at the assailing Archer. But this was a pittance in comparison to Aikida's missile salvo, blowing Carlyle off his feet. Even Isuru Koga turned his attention away from the Widow to aid de Villar with a hail of missile fire against Nichols' Phoenix Hawk, and it resulted in a less than stellar outcome. Other shots flew thick and fast, but when the smoke cleared, the 4 Widow light mechs were still standing and were very eager to finally make good their escape.
Yeah.